Hi, I'm Jenny Taylor Martin, a director here at Edgar Cayce's A.R.E. Today I'll be interviewing Judith Pennington. Judith is an internationally published journalist, a life coach, a meditation expert, and the author of Your Psychic Soul, Embracing Your Sixth Sense. Judith, it's so nice to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, Jenny. I'm delighted to be here and with your listeners.
Judith, in your book you share a very personal psychic experience that you felt had saved you from a serious illness. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure, yeah. That was easily the most profound experience of my life because it set me on a spiritual journey, whereas that was not my direction before. I was about 24, maybe 25 years old, and I had felt a very sharp pain in my lower abdomen that was just incessant. It was stabbing day and night, and finally I realized it wasn't going to go away, so I went to the doctor. The doctor examined me, and he looked a little startled, and he said, well, come back on my lunch hour on Monday. And I didn't think much of it at the time. Went about my business for the weekend. And on Monday morning, I got on the interstate in my little red Carmen Ghia, driving along, and suddenly it struck me that it was his lunch hour, and that couldn't be common. And all of a sudden, I became afraid, and I heard myself saying, no matter if there is a God, would you please help me? I don't let anything happen to me because there's no one to take care of my little girl who was 2 years old at the time, and there really wasn't. But before I finished that sentence in my head, that little prayer, something strange happened. It was a cold chill that ran through my body, the kind of thing you get when you watch a horror show, you know. It's a very quick, cold chill. But then instantaneously it turned into this beautiful, flowing, warm light. And it was so intense and grew more and more intense with each passing moment. I realized that I was in the middle of something extraordinary that was happening to me. And I just threw my head back and said, what is this? What is this? And it got stronger and stronger. And I looked down at my arms because it felt like my pores were opening up and I couldn't see any difference. And then I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw that I was crying. I was just weeping because I was inside of this bliss and joy and this beautiful light. And it went on and grew stronger and stronger. And it felt like I had moved out of my body, up and out, and as if I were behind my body. And I could see my hands on the steering wheel, but I wasn't my normal self. And it felt like I was in some timeless realm where I knew that when you die, that's what you feel, that you move into this explosion of light. And then on the other side, there's only this light and this love that is the motivating force of this light. And I wanted to be in that space, in that place, and nowhere else. But then at some point, and who knows how long it was, in actuality, I realized that I was moving back into my body and I could feel my hands on the steering wheel again. Not completely, but I looked ahead and there was my interstate exit. I measured this later on and it was about 15 or 20 minutes, depending on how fast I was driving, and I don't know how fast I was. But then I could, as I approached the exit, I could feel myself moving back into my hands, and then I could steer, and I went to my apartment and prepared for the doctor visit, and I called my mother-in-law, who was a charismatic Christian, and told her what had happened. She said, "You've had a healing." And I went, "Oh, yeah, I've been to that church and don't believe that stuff, but something sure happened." And went to the doctor, and he examined me and looked very surprised and said, well, there was a tumor the size of a golf ball or an orange on one of your ovaries, and it's gone now. It must have been the medicine that I gave you over the weekend. Well, that stabbing pain had been there just before that healing, and I just smiled and said, yeah, it must have been the medicine, but I knew it wasn't, of course. And that that there was some healing power either within me or outside of me. At that time in my life, I still thought in either ors, and never occurred to me. But in the ensuing years, even as I continued my disbelief in God, I was kind of suspending belief at that point. I didn't have much respect for Jesus because I thought, could have done a better job, look at the world as it is. I had real issues with organized religion. I had to put all that on hold because of this thing that happened. And it really was the beginning for me. I didn't realize it, but on an unconscious level, synchronicities were beginning to line up. And in fact, that's what happened for many years until I got an answer. I tried to tell a couple of people about it, and they just looked at me like I was crazy. So it was something I had to keep to myself. But I never forgot it, and still today I can remember every moment of it and how it felt. It was amazing and beautiful and wonderful, and I'm so happy that it happened.
And that was the first time you'd had an experience like that?
Actually, it wasn't. Some months earlier, I had been in a church, and I was with my charismatic mother-in-law, and she'd come to take my daughter back to Baton Rouge. I was in Florida. And I had walked in the church with her, having all of my attitudes about religion, but my daughter went to that church school. And I sat down on a pew and tuned out the preacher. I didn't want to hear anything he had to say. And I kind of spontaneously slipped into some kind of, I guess, trance state where this peace came over me, this incredible peace, and my heartbreak over the loss of the relationship, the loss of my marriage, over my worry and fear, everything just disappeared. And when I came conscious again, I was just crying and crying. And this woman came up to me afterwards and handed me a Bible and said, "This is going to make more sense to you now." She had seen what happened to me, and I went, "Oh, the Bible, I can't stand that stupid Bible." But I read it, and it was like I was reading it from a different level of consciousness. Suddenly, my mind penetrated the words, but it wasn't that I took them literally. It was that I saw them in a more multidimensional way and understood the truth of them. But as the months passed, my thinking mind got involved and I watched all the healings in my mother-in-law's church and went, they're just making this up. It's just some kind of emotionality that's triggering their imagination. So I had discounted the whole thing until this healing in my car. And at that point I went, okay, something real is happening.
Your book is dedicated to Edgar Cayce. When did you discover the Cayce readings, and what has that meant to you?
Yeah, it meant the world to me. I'll give you a little backstory to that so it makes more sense. So I was maybe 24, 25 when that healing happened, but with no one to talk to, I just went along my merry way, worked for an arts council, did some stories on creativity and the brain and the arts. And I think because this unconscious synchronicity was going on, that things were lining up. I was being assigned to stories by these magazines, and they would take me into a hot yoga class or an isolation tank. And I noticed that my thinking mind just was chattering. But after a while, it would drop into this lovely space that was kind of like where I'd been with that healing, and very much like where I'd been as a child out in nature and very connected with myself. And so the years passed, divorces, sadnesses. My professional life was always great. I was a writer, a freelance writer, and the head of a peace and justice group. But on the personal level, something was missing, and it was big time missing. And I was very unhappy. And when I was 38 years old, I heard this inner voice that said, sit down, pick up pen and paper, and write what you hear. And I had just finished writing an article about a social justice advocate, and I was awake. It was the wee hours of the morning, but my thinking mind was kind of tired. My body was kind of tired. And it turned out I was in a perfect state for hearing a meditative writing, as I called it. that for the next many years guided me out of my sense of aloneness back to that space where I'd been on that interstate, and during that healing where I didn't feel like I was alone. I felt like there was some other source or force in the universe that was guiding me and listening to me. And so one day, and the writing started in 1987, in 1993, the writing said that I would come in contact with something that would teach me to meditate, and it was going to start a whole new era of my life. And the writings had talked about meditation before, but I didn't know how to meditate or what it was, so I'd never followed through on it. Well, so suddenly, not long after that, I was in San Francisco in a used bookstore, and with my last $5 bought 2 little pocketbooks on Edgar Cayce and read them in the airplane on the way back, and they talked about study groups. And I really wanted to be in a study group, but I lost both of the little books, somehow left them in the plane. And the next thing I knew, I got this notification of a meeting about study groups in a library. Bruce and Elizabeth Bickham were holding one, and I walked into the library room, and my eyes fell upon 6 people in particular, and I had this little push that said, oops, something's going to happen here. It turned out that they came to the study group that I started, and we held together for 10 years. And in the very first chapter, the meditation chapter of A Search for God, I found everything my meditative writings had taught me for the previous 7 years. I was just astonished. An energetic concept of God that completely melded with the meditative writings it said, and I just fell in love with Edgar Cayce, and meditation did in fact prove to be a major change in my life that gave me the inner peace all day long, and more guidance. The synchronicities increased at that point, the intuition increased, and so that really was a turning point. I read There is a River and was completely convinced that Cayce knew everything he was talking about because it connected so perfectly with my own experience. And yeah, so I've been a big Cayce follower ever since.
The meditative writing you're talking about right now is also taught by you in your book. What's the difference between meditative writing and automatic writing?
Well, Cayce actually addressed this. Automatic writing is when you surrender your consciousness to an external force and write what that force says, but you're not consciously aware of what you're doing. Meditative or inspired writing is completely different. It is a deep inner listening where there's just you and the pen and the paper, and from deep inside you arises a word or a phrase, and you hear it, and in my case, since I'm a journalist and such a skeptic, I would have to hear it twice to make sure that it wasn't my thinking mind. But I, in the first days, would hear it, and I knew it didn't come from me because it didn't feel like that. So I would write down the words, and then listening still, more words would come, and to my utter astonishment, it made sense, because as a writer, you know, you're always arranging things and changing things, and no phrase goes unchanged. But this was different. This was a complete integration, and of a goodness much greater than my own, and a wisdom far beyond anything I'd ever run across. I wasn't, you know, had an English background, so I had read the great poetry and the great novels, and this was much more, it was clearly something that I thought was from outside of me, but as the years wore on, revealed itself to be my own soul. And so I ended up writing a book called The Voice of the Soul. It was a spiritual memoir. And at that point, I matched up my diaries and meditative writings and my memories, and I realized that I had been guided predictively, precognitively the entire way, and I was just astonished, and I still do it today. You know how it is that the more you learn, the more challenge and complexity come to you. So sure enough, anytime I feel overwhelmed, I just pick up that pen, and now I dialogue and ask questions, and sometimes if I don't understand something, I can get even aggressive and say, but you said, and the meditative writing will then explain to me something I had completely missed from my ego's lower perspective. You get that higher perspective. It's a much broader scope and understanding, and it's just been a godsend to me. And I hope that the people who read the book will get something out of it as well.
Your book was featured in our Book of the Month Club on Facebook, and it got so much positive feedback. I think everyone loved the tools that you gave. What do you think is the most important tool to psychic development?
Well, I love dreams because it's almost like you get to do self-discovery work and healing work while you're asleep. You don't even have to work at it, it just comes. But I think of the three, inspired writing and dreams and meditation, that meditation is by far the most powerful. Not only because you're going down into the realm of your soul, which can then speak to you in visions and voices and a sense of inner knowing and feeling, but also because of the very real physical benefits that come out of meditation. One is that the two halves of the brain are balanced and more closely coordinate with the nervous system, which enables the brain and consciousness to then start to heal the body on a cellular level. But then there's a synchronization of the voluntary and involuntary nervous systems, which is what gives us that sense of inner peace and unity, and a uniting in the mind's consciousness, so that when you go down into meditation, you're able from a very deep soul perspective to see what's wrong and what needs repair, and up comes the information on how to repair it. But I think the most profound thing is that when you're down in the deep realm of the subconscious soul, there is what Cayce called a spiritualizing effect, so that higher energies are able to move into your body, mind, and spirit. And there's an evolutionary process that takes place just as you sit in silent meditation. And it's incomparable because it's longer. You're there for a longer, more protracted period, and it conditions the body, mind, and spirit so that ultimately you bring that out of meditation, and that's who you are.
Judith, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate it, and I hope your listeners benefited, and invite them to contact me at any time.
Your Psychic Soul, Embracing Your Sixth Sense is published by Fourth Dimension Press, an imprint of A.R.E. Press, and is available at arecatalog.com.